All right, everyone, welcome to the final installment of our CNV Web Series. Today, we're going to be focusing on your questions. We'll review a few questions that we've received through various venues, the survey, email, Twitter, etc., and then we'll open it up for any additional questions at the end. As a reminder, just as before, please type your questions into the Q&A box and not the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. Before we start going through questions, I'll just put up today's attendance URL and QR code. Remember, we ask that you take a moment to fill this out, as it really does help us get a sense of the audience we've had for this web series, and it helps us to figure out if there are groups of people we need to do a better job at reaching. If you're watching a recording of this later on, remember that we'd also like you to fill out the attendance survey as well. To use the QR code, simply open your phone's camera and focus it on the image. It should take you directly to the survey. If you don't want to do that, feel free to visit the URL at the bottom of the screen, and someone will paste this link into the chat in just a few minutes. Just a few general announcements. Immediately following this webinar, you should receive a feedback survey. The survey will go out to anyone who registered for the series. If you've been attending but never formally registered, please take a moment to do so. If you've been receiving those weekly emails that come from ClinGen providing you with details about the week's CNV webinar, then that means you're registered and you'll receive the feedback survey. We'd really appreciate your feedback, not only about how you felt about this inaugural web series, how it went, but about what other educational initiatives you think we should consider. The survey will be open through the end of the month, March 31st. For those of you that signed up back in December for our formal pre and post web series CNV evaluation projects, you will be receiving your post-series CNV evaluation assignments shortly via email. If you know that you signed up for this project but do not receive an email with assignments by next week, please contact us at clingen@clinicalgenome.org. We will follow the same procedure as the pre-series evaluation. You'll receive 5 CNVs to evaluate using the scoring metrics. We'll send you an Excel template should you wish to keep a copy of your notes, but please enter all of your final information via the SurveyMonkey links you will receive in your email. Please complete as many as you can by April 9th, 2020, and recognition for your work will be commensurate with your level of participation. We did also receive a few requests from people who were not able to sign up for the formal pre and post series evaluation project back in December about the availability of practice CNVs. So we decided to make this available to anyone who was interested. If you did not sign up for the evaluation project in December, but you still would like the opportunity to practice using the CNV scoring metrics, please sign up via the link at the bottom of the screen. We will also send you a set of 5 CNVs to evaluate on your own, and you will have the option of also contributing your answers via SurveyMonkey to help us analyze the effectiveness of this series. So if you will sign up via that link in blue there by next Friday, March 20th, we can get those out to you. Now, note that unlike those people who also contributed to the pre-series evaluations, you won't receive any formal recognition for this work, and the only personal benefit to you will be the opportunity to practice. I just want to be upfront with that. We will post the answers to each of the CNVs on our website after the April 17th due date, so you can check your work. All right. So with that, let's move on to questions. So the first question that we received is regarding some wording that appears at the top of section 4, instructing users to skip to section 5 if your CNV overlapped with an established dosage-sensitive gene or region in section 2. The question is, if you did score evidence in section 2 but did not reach pathogenic or benign, should you also score evidence in section 4, or should you skip section 4? And that's the text on the screen with the red line under it. So the answer to this question is yes. If your CNV overlapped with a known dosage-sensitive gene or region in section 2, but for whatever reason did not warrant enough points to reach a classification of pathogenic or benign, then yes, please do continue to accumulate additional evidence in an attempt to reach one of these terminal classifications. This wording was added to this top of Section 4 in an attempt to help people who had already reached benign or pathogenic in Section 2 understand that they were not also obligated to collect individual case evidence through Section 4. If this is not the case for your CNV, keep on collecting evidence. So, for example, say that your CNV was an intragenic deletion of a known haploinsufficient gene that was believed to be in frame. The role of the region in the overall protein function is unknown, and population variants in that particular area are rare. The variant is believed to remove less than 10% of the protein. If you're following along in the Abutayun et al. PBS1 flowchart, a variant like this might be awarded 0.30 points in Section 2. If you stopped here, this variant would be classified as VUS. Instead, you should continue working through the metrics to see if you can identify enough evidence, such as similar literature cases, to reach pathogenic. All right, question 2, and this is one that came up several different times, so I think it's good to talk about it here. So when is it appropriate to use public database cases as evidence? And so the answer to this is really, when considering whether or not to use any case as evidence, think about the following things. Is variant classification provided? If one's provided, do the submitters provide you with rationale for their classification? If you're looking in ClinVar, for example, this can be achieved by A, providing you with their general variant evaluation methodology, which is what they need to be a one-star submitter, and B, providing you with the type of variant-specific information you might find under that comment on clinical significant field. If they don't provide a variant classification, this doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't use the case, but you should be provided enough information about the variant to start coming to your own conclusions. So, for example, say that there wasn't even enough information provided to unambiguously identify the variant, like maybe only the PDOT information was provided or the transcript wasn't given, etc. Without that kind of information, you might not even be able to say with confidence, for example, whether or not the variant was present or absent in a population database. And so that might be an example of a case that you choose not to use as evidence. What is the phenotype of this particular case? Does it match with what's expected and or your own personal case? Is it specific or not specific? Are you provided with enough information to tell? So say, for example, that the phenotype you're evaluating is something like blepharophimosis, and the database case that you're looking at says the case has dysmorphic features. Well, are those things the same thing? Are they talking about something else entirely? Dysmorphic features could mean any number of things, and while it isn't necessarily discordant with your phenotype, it's not exactly a match either. And so this may be a case that you choose not to use as evidence. Another thing to think about, can you tell the method by which the variant was identified? Do you have any sense of whether or not other possible cases for this phenotype have been rolled out? Often this type of information is unavailable for database cases, and you don't know whether that variant reported in association with developmental delay was found on candidate gene sequencing or exome sequencing, for example. In some cases, the phenotype that you're dealing with may be so specific that this doesn't matter as much. So, for example, a variant reported in ATP7B associated with Wilson syndrome, and a case reported as having Kaiser-Fleischer rings. But in other conditions, particularly those associated with high genetic heterogeneity, such as neurodevelopmental disorders, it may be very important to know what has been excluded before considering a case to be valid evidence. Similarly, are you provided with any information about other variants that may have been identified in this person? This type of information is often available in Decipher. If other variants are reported and they've not been classified as benign, though, it may call into question the role of any one particular variant plays in that patient's overall clinical presentation. A similar thought process applies to inheritance information, with the added consideration that public database cases often don't provide clarifying phenotype information on the parents. So a variant may be listed as being maternally or paternally inherited, but we really have no idea if that makes sense in the context of the family history or not. Again, using my favorite example, neurodevelopmental disorders as a cautionary tale, we also may not know how carefully the parents were actually evaluated. And then finally, ask yourself, do I really need this case in order to complete my assessment? If you're dealing with a gene or a region that has considerable evidence, you can be picky in the cases that you choose to count. Give preference to the most straightforward ones, the ones where you have no doubt.
Hey, Erin, we just lost you on audio. Hi, everybody. This is Erica Anderson here. I just got a message from Erin. She got dropped from the call, so she's going to be logging back in. Please just hang on for a couple minutes. In the meantime, if you have any questions, just start to submit them to the Q&A. I see some questions that are coming in already, and we'll jump back on as soon as she's here. And I can also try to answer questions or route them to be answered live for those of us that are panelists today.
Hello, Erica, can you verify that you can hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh my gosh, you guys, I'm so sorry. My phone dropped the call. So I'm glad I realized that before I just kept on talking and talking and talking. I think that where we left off was that these considerations that we were just reviewing really apply to any case. These aren't just questions you should ask yourself when you're looking at database cases. They really apply to literature as well, but they're helpful in multiple situations. So let's walk through an example that someone sent in, questioning whether or not it would be appropriate to use the two decipher cases below in our example case W. And that was the one we talked about on the January 30th webinar. To refresh your memory, case W was a duplication that involved the entire LMNB1 gene, which is associated with adult onset leukodystrophy. So let's take a look into the first case. The variant present in the case is the blue bar with the black box around it in the browser screenshot. You can see via the dashed vertical lines that the patient's duplication includes all of LMNB1, just like our example case, which is appropriate. When you look deeper into that case's information, however, you see that the case was last clinically assessed at age 15. We know that the particular phenotype we're dealing with is adult onset, typically in the 40s or 50s. The decipher patient's phenotype includes autistic behavior, speech delays, hyperactivity, etc. There's no specific mention of leukodystrophy, which is not unusual given our expected age of onset. So this case is not giving us really any confirmation that having a duplication of LMNB1 results in leukodystrophy. It wouldn't be a good one to count. You might ask yourself, well, should we maybe count this for negative points then because we've got a case with the variant but not the expected phenotype? Should we say that this is an instance of inconsistent phenotype? To that, I would say no. There's a plausible explanation for the lack of expected phenotype here, which is the case's age. His other features may have nothing to do with this particular variant or could represent an expansion of the phenotype, though of course it would be spurious to make this claim based on a single case. So let's move on to the second case. First, notice that this variant, the blue bar in the black box at the bottom of the screen, does not appear to include the LMNB1 gene. So for this reason alone, it may not be an appropriate case to count as evidence. But there are also other potential reasons as well that I'd like to point out. So first, notice in the top left that the age of this case is unknown. We have no idea if this is someone who is of age to be demonstrating the clinical features or not. Could be a newborn, could be an elderly lady, we really don't know. Second, at the top right, notice that the state of phenotype is cognitive impairment. This isn't quite what we're looking for. It's kind of similar to that blepharophimosis dysmorphic features example that I gave earlier. It's not inconsistent, as individuals with leukodystrophy do demonstrate cognitive decline, but it could also be something else entirely, like intellectual disability in a child. Without an age here, it's hard to tell. And we never want to make assumptions or guess at what may or may not be true of a case. And finally, notice that this case has two other variants in addition to the one that we're looking at. They're all duplications of unknown inheritance. They're all listed here as being of uncertain significance. And in this case, with such little information, we really have no idea how they may be contributing or not to this person's phenotype. The bottom line here is there's more than one reason not to count this particular case. And you may recall that this particular duplication has an abundance of evidence in the published literature. We were easily able to reach Pathogenic with that information without needing to worry about either of these cases. So next question, somebody sent in, what resources or websites would you recommend for analyzing functionally important domains or exons in a gene? So unfortunately, I am not aware of a single reliable source that has this information for all genes. And if anyone does have any specific recommendations for sources that you found helpful, please feel free to share them in the Q&A for others to see. In most cases, you'll need to review the literature in order to assess this type of information. In this regard, it might be helpful for laboratories to keep records or a database to collect information like this or case information on a gene-by-gene basis as you evaluate them. I'm sure many of you already do this, but in case you don't, it's something to consider. Obviously, places like Entrez and Ensembl will provide basic information and are always a good place to start. If you're fortunate enough to be evaluating a gene that is the focus of a ClinGen variant curation expert panel, or VSEP, you should be able to get information about mutational hotspots and/or critical functional domains from their specifications to the ACMG AMP sequence variant guidelines, such as the PM1 criteria. Approved VSEP specifications are available on our website at the URL on the screen. At the bottom of the screen, I'm showing you just a screenshot of the type of information available from our P10 VSEP, for example. And you can read more about that specific group's modifications in Mester et al. 2018 PubMed ID at the bottom right. If you aren't sure which transcript you should be using for a particular gene, one helpful place to start is the MAIN project, which stands for Matched Annotation from the NCBI and Ensembl-basic. This is a collaboration between the two groups to identify one transcript for each protein coding locus that matches GRCH38 sequence, is 100% identical between the RefSeq and the corresponding Ensembl transcripts, is well supported, expressed and conserved, and representative of the biology at each locus. These transcripts are available at the FTP site on the right, but the information is also available through the Ensembl website and is represented as a track within UCSC. In addition to providing at least one main select transcript for each protein coding locus, the group may also release main plus transcripts for certain genes that might include additional well-supported transcripts of particular interest, such as for clinical reporting. Another resource that can be helpful in helping you get a sense of which exons in a gene might be of particular interest is Nomad. Many of you you might be familiar with this, but you can actually configure the display to show additional transcripts, as well as to show tissue expression data from GTEx. You can also get a sense of where the ClinVar variants are, which are presumably, but of course not always, observed in affected individuals versus the population variants. When I click to expand those boxes that I had boxed in red on the previous slide, I can get a better visual sense of the differences between the available transcripts, as well as differences in exon level expression. You can see that the area in the vertical red box is not included in all of the transcripts, and additionally has decreased expression levels compared to the other exons. You can also see that the population variants are clustered there as opposed to the ClinVar variants, which are elsewhere throughout the gene. Further, in the horizontal red box, you can see that the transcript that appears to be the most widely expressed does not include those exons. This information might suggest that those exons are not critical to function, and variants identified in those areas should be evaluated with caution. Those are just a few examples. I'm sure there are many more resources that are important, but everyone please feel free to add additional suggestions in the Q&A box. Question 4 is one that we also received relatively frequently. How do I determine which phenotype category to use? So unfortunately, again, there's no one specific black and white answer to this question. We currently do not have a set threshold for this, but this would certainly be an excellent question to examine for anyone with bioinformatics or statistical expertise. In general, however, you'll need to use your clinical judgment in order to determine this and ask yourselves questions such as, how sure am I that the phenotype I've been given is accurate? For example, if the phenotype that you've been given, going back to our leukodystrophy example, is leukodystrophy, as diagnosed by MRI, you can be reasonably certain that this is the correct phenotype and can make decisions accordingly. However, if the phenotype you're given is autistic features, you might be more skeptical. What does that mean? Does the person truly have autism? Was this diagnosed by a developmental pediatrician following proper testing protocol? Or is this assumed by someone after a 15-minute brief consult? Your confidence in the phenotype is directly related to your confidence in the gene. If you aren't even sure that your phenotype is accurate, how can you really be sure that you're assessing the correct gene? The more confident you can be in these things, the more appropriate it may be to use that more specific category. If you are ever unsure, your default should be the non-specific category. In general, the highly specific, relatively unique phenotype is a category you should use rarely, but one you should use when you're truly confident that your variant includes the correct gene. Examples of this might include a condition with pathogenic feature, conditions that have some kind of aspect of biochemical conformation, conditions that are caused by a small number of genes, but all those other causes have been ruled out. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the non-specific category, which is shown at the bottom of the arrow figure in blue. This is probably the category that you will use the most frequently. When your phenotype is primarily something non-specific, such as developmental delay, intellectual disability, seizures that have not otherwise been specified, autism, etc., you should be using this category. Again, if you're ever in any doubt, go with this category. The middle category, which is highly specific, not necessarily unique, is somewhere between the two. Use this when you're dealing with something more distinct and less commonly observed than, for example, the conditions we just mentioned and associated with the non-specific category. This category is also appropriate for phenotypes with less genetic heterogeneity and or less potential for non-genetic etiologies, things that are almost always genetic in nature but are perhaps caused by multiple different genes. So again, our leukodystrophy example is a good one there. You may also use this category when your phenotype is unique, but you're not certain that the other potential causes have been ruled out. All right, question 5. Has artificial intelligence been used to help with classification? Could this be done in the future? So in general, ClinGen is not aware of anyone routinely using AI to help with classification, but please, if any members of the audience have a different experience, feel free to share it in the Q&A. There are certainly some aspects of the scoring metric that can be automated right now, things like gene count or overlap with dosage sensitivity curations. And it's also possible that AI will be able to help with other aspects in the future. This, of course, would need to be carefully tested before widespread use and will not be able to substitute for clinical judgment and human evaluation in all circumstances. We are aware of various companies working on tools to help with the CNV evaluation process. And while ClinGen does not formally endorse any outside tools, we want to make sure everyone realizes, everyone is free to use the metrics and the supporting materials to create the tools that they feel will be helpful to the community. Always test these out carefully yourself to make sure they work as you are expecting before using them in the clinical setting. Question 6. We did receive a question asking if there was a consensus about the reporting of variants associated with adult onset disorders in the context of prenatal diagnosis. So on this slide, I'm drawing your attention to the following. In January 2020, ACMG published the following points to consider document regarding the use of exome sequencing in the context of prenatal diagnosis. In it, they explicitly state that variants without a known fetal or childhood phenotype not be reported. Of course, this document was written in the context of exome sequencing, but I would imagine that similar principles apply to chromosomal microarray testing. Prior to this, ACMG, along with the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine, held a joint workshop focused on prenatal genetic testing in 2017. And the summary of that meeting, which were published in a special issue of Seminars in Perinatology in 2018, they also recommended that adult onset conditions not be included on expanded carrier screening panels. In general, however, if a lab decides that they will not return a certain type of result in any context for any reason, they should just very clearly state this on their ordering materials and results. So question 7, how do I use the scoring metrics to evaluate CNVs on the X chromosome? So in general, you would evaluate CNVs on the X chromosome just the same way that you would any other CNV. However, we recognize that some modifications may need to be made given the unique circumstances that can be associated with CNVs on the X chromosome. ClinGen is currently working on specific guidance in this area, but in the meantime, keep the following in mind. There are different possible scenarios, of course, depending on the specific gene or disorders involved. So some X-linked disorders, males are predominantly affected, with females ranging from normal to affected for a variety of reasons. But of course, there are also X-linked disorders where females are predominantly affected and the condition is typically lethal in males. Because of this, use caution before awarding negative points for apparent non-segregation, and use clinical judgment when interpreting the results of exon activation studies. Could there be a valid reason for an affected female to have exon activation results skewed towards the normal allele, or is this truly evidence that there is an alternate cause? Realize that with X-linked disorders, you may not be able to use the de novo category as frequently due to the often inherited nature of X-linked variants. It's possible that most of your evidence will be in the form of segregation or single affected males in the context of a negative family history. In regards to the former, segregation, remember the maximum number of points allotted in the segregation category and when it might be appropriate to override this. And this is something that we talked about on the January 30th webinar during case W. And so you can find that case at the URL listed there or review that webinar on our YouTube channel. Again, also remember not to artificially inflate your segregation count with genotype positive unaffected females who are not obligate carriers. Again, an example of that is also provided on that January 30th webinar. When you're evaluating single cases of affected males with no family history and a variant inherited from an unaffected mother, be careful and be conservative. If you're dealing with neurodevelopmental disorders, remember how many genes associated with neurodevelopmental disorders are on the X chromosome. Are you sure that yours is the correct one? Again, have other potential causes of the phenotype been ruled out? Is there any functional evidence to support the idea that this variant is causative? If you aren't sure these things, consider downgrading or not counting those types of cases. Next question, question 8. How do I use the scoring metrics to evaluate autosomal recessive genes? The short answer is that you don't. So the scoring metrics were created for the evaluation of autosomal dominant genes or genomic regions of reasonable penetrance. And as we state in our supplemental material, number 1, when evaluating a multi-gene CNV, give precedence to the genes in the region that are associated with dominantly inherited disorders caused by an appropriate mutational mechanism. So while the scoring metrics are not built to formally evaluate AR genes, the subsequent guidance on reporting is simply asking people not to ignore situations in which the patient is clearly at least a carrier for a well-established condition in which loss of function is a disease mechanism. Further, in an effort to be more consistent with the way that such variants might be classified if they were sequence variants, we suggest that these losses of genes in which loss of function is known to cause a well-established condition be classified as pathogenic if appropriate, as opposed to something like VUS, likely benign, or benign, which may have been used in the past because they were not related to the patient's phenotype. How do you know when a gene is associated with a well-established condition? What do we mean by that? Some suggestions might include those genes that have been evaluated by the ClinGen gene disease validity process as being strong or definitive, things with gene reviews, or other sources demonstrating convincing evidence to support the gene-disease relationship. ClinGen gene curations are available on our website, either by searching for a specific gene or by clicking Browse Curations, selecting gene disease validity, then sorting the list by mode of inheritance if you are interested in finding all of the autosomal recessive conditions. From there, you'd need to evaluate whether or not loss of function is an established disease mechanism. If these things aren't apparent, it may not be appropriate to call the variant pathogenic based on this gene alone. Again, the point is not to ask labs to fully evaluate every single autosomal recessive gene they encounter. We just simply want to encourage labs, if not otherwise against their clearly established reporting policy, to appropriately alert providers and patients to situations where it's readily apparent that the patient is at least a carrier for a certain condition. For question 9, how do I use the scoring metrics to evaluate recurrent regions? Again, as we just discussed, the scoring metrics were created for the evaluation of autosomal dominant genes or genomic regions of reasonable penetrance. We recognize that several of the recurrent regions pose considerable difficulty in terms of classification and reporting due to their association with reduced penetrance and/or variable expressivity. There's a general lack of consensus within the community on how to report these in particular. ClinGen is also currently working on specific guidance in this area on a couple of fronts. So number one, as Erica mentioned to you on the January 23rd webinar, we're currently developing a framework to evaluate these regions for our dosage sensitivity curation process. Number two, the ClinGen low penetrance risk allele working group is working on terminology recommendations to help in classifying these and other low penetrance variants, sequence and copy number. An initial recommendation is available at the URL on the screen, essentially suggesting that labs add the qualifier low penetrance after the standard classification, so pathogenic, low penetrance, etc. And number three, we're currently discussing additional ways to provide education and or come to consensus on these difficult regions. So please stay tuned for additional information on that. And there is specifically a question in the feedback survey that you will get later today, asking you if you'd like to remain up to date with ClinGen communications. So if you're interested in this topic in particular, please do go into that survey and indicate that you're interested in receiving further communication so we can let you know when we have additional information for you. And Erica, I will just check in with you quickly to see if you had anything you wanted to add on that particular question.
No, just that, and I think you've covered it well here, Erin. But yeah, just to let the group know that I'm also the co-chair of the recurrent CNV dosage evaluation group, and we did have a presentation that was planned at ACMG. Unfortunately, the meeting was canceled, but in terms of curation, we are actively working on developing a metric that incorporates things like case control studies, which Brad Coe talked about several weeks ago, population frequency, and what constitutes established low penetrance versus penetrance that isn't well understood. And we're working very closely with the upcoming guidance from the low penetrance risk allele working group to sort of align with efforts there, which are looking not only at copy number variants, but sequence variants across multiple clinical phenotypes. So yeah, I would say stay tuned. We don't have easy answers because these aren't easy answers to achieve, but we are very aware of the lack of consistency in this area and actively working on it.
All right, thank you. And then the final one of our kind of pre-prepared questions is, how are clinical laboratories implementing the new technical standards? And I will again turn this one over to Erica, who will briefly walk you through one lab's preliminary thoughts on this.
Yeah, and so we did sort of send it out in unofficial, I guess it wasn't a survey, but just had a discussion amongst our working group members to see, if anybody could kind of talk about how their lab is currently implementing. And what I can tell everybody on this call is that we're still actively working on it ourselves. So if you haven't put a process in place, don't panic. This is kind of the time that we're all really trying to understand how to implement these guidelines and determine how this is really going to change our clinical evaluation and reporting practices. I did see a number of, or at least one question on the Q&A that was asking about reporting criteria or maybe there were 2 questions. And so before I kind of jump into this workflow here, I just wanted to read the very first paragraph of our supplemental material 1 document from the paper. So this is about appropriate use of the scoring metrics. And what we state is that the use of these scoring metrics presumes that a CNV otherwise meets the lab's size and quality thresholds for reporting. And so we recommended that any size restriction for inclusion of a CNV on a clinical report really be based on the laboratory's consideration of performance characteristics and limitations of the methodology first. But we also do include a statement about generation of a reasonable amount of clinical follow-up, rather than assumptions regarding clinical significance just based on size alone. And so I think that that's a concept that still reflects the laboratory reporting practices that are being performed out there across multiple labs. If you encounter a small CNV that doesn't include any genes in it, first of all, in the first part of the metric, there will be a subtraction of points, and that may still come out as a bust, but you know, it really depends on the size of the variant in our lab as to whether we would report something. So we still do rely on some size criteria in thinking about what constitutes a reasonable amount of clinical follow-up. So what I have here is, this is a slide that was put together by one of our fellows, Jian Zhao. And like I said, this is still very much a work in progress. This is an example of how we're trying to implement the new standards into CNV evaluation workflows in our group at ARUP. And at ARUP, we have you know, multiple platforms that we're running here. We have platforms running across different departments, and then we have different levels of expertise in terms of not only experience, but also people's areas of focus. We have some folks that are more accustomed to looking at, you know, multi-genic CNVs that are being called off of microarray platforms. And then we have other people who have expertise on looking at gene level variants. And then we have people who can do both. So that's one of the processes that we're trying to implement here, is deciding who to involve in different areas of metric evaluation. And our goal is really to identify areas of the workflow that we can leverage that expertise. So just starting from the top of the slide here, the first kind of question that you ask when you're encountering a variant is, have we seen it before? And if we have, and it's been evaluated recently, and I don't want to put a time limit on that because we're still trying to establish a process for how frequently we're reevaluating evidence, you can use this classification. So let's say I saw the same variant 2 weeks ago. It's very likely that the information has not changed during that time. So you can reuse classifications. But we all know that for copy number variants, unlike sequence variants, oftentimes the breakpoints are variable. So you're often just taking every variant that you encounter through some sort of evaluation process. And I also just want to say that these metrics were built by, you know, the people on our committee sort of built these metrics to reflect our current evaluation processes, and just to provide more of a, you know, a points-based system for how you actually take things through. I did see a question about how we established point ranges, and maybe Erin, we can talk about that. But the first question that you ask is this a known benign region? And so we're trying to overlay this process with sources of information like the ClinGen dosage sensitivity map, where you can go to and find established benign regions. That's an area that we're also actively working on. And if it's not known to be a benign, then your next question is whether there are genes involved. And if they are or not, you're going to be next looking at population frequencies. If they're very high, above 1%, some of these are going to automatically be classified as as benigns. If they're above 0.1%, they may be classified as likely benign, but you still need to take some of these through the metric. So in the section where we are looking at overlap with established dosage-sensitive regions or genes, that's going to be the next section. And again, this is just a reiteration of what's in the metric, overlaid with the sources of information that we're using. Then if you were to find a known, say, haploinsufficient gene, the next question you're asking is whether there's more than one gene involved, and if it's a region, you want to determine whether that is completely overlapped by a region that's already been curated or not. And some of those will be routed to automatically be pathogenic per our scoring metric. But a lot of our multigenic CNVs end up going into this sort of lower left-hand side of the metric, where we're asking how many protein coding genes are there. This is where you would refer to RefSeq. And I did see a question about the use of RefSeq versus Ensembl. My suggestion is, if there are discrepancies, to use RefSeq, because I believe that is the source of gene counting that we use to develop the scores. Erin, I don't know if you saw that question, but feel free to jump in on that after I'm done working through this. And then you will next do a lit evaluation. And here you're incorporating things like the dosage sensitivity map. You're doing PubMed searches, Google. In our lab, we use HGMD to look at both CNVs and genes, although that is a source of gene level curation primarily. And we also look at things like common variation that may be at variants that may be documented in the DGV or NOMAD that are observed at a lower frequency than would be captured higher up in this metric. And then as part of the evaluation, you want to also kind of focus on individual genes. So this is where you'd be looking at the ClinGen dosage sensitivity score, OMIM, again, HGMD, and other sources of gene level curation, including the other ClinGen curation efforts. Haploinsufficiency predictors, we refer people to NOMAD and Decipher for that in the metric. And then at the bottom, you'll go through your entire curation. So I kind of incorporated all of the sources of information in the curation section. Then you're going to consider the phenotype, inheritance, family history, and that will result in the final evaluation. So again, this is very much just us trying to sort of map out what our processes are. If you were to have on the right-hand side of this, on the kind of lower right-hand side, let's say you had a gene level CNV, or you had a partial gene duplication. I think that was one of the questions I also saw. Those are the types of variants that may be routed to somebody who has molecular level expertise, who can look at some of the sources of information like GTEx, NOMAD, HGMD, UniPro, and Mutilizer, which are, as far as I understand, they're all free source information about predicting things like frame, whether a CNV could disrupt reading frame, functional domains, and things like that. Okay, so Erin, I think that's all I wanted to say about this. If there are any questions specifically about our processes, I'm happy to answer them, or we can just jump into the questions in the Q&A.
Okay, I think I saw quickly someone did ask you how recently is recently in your top left corner.
Yes, and as I mentioned, this is a process that we're still trying to establish here at ARUP. I can tell you that on the sequence variant side of things, we evaluate any variant that has been observed in our laboratory 6 months ago or greater in terms of time. So if we've seen the same variant in the past 6 months, we will not initiate a new evaluation. We're trying to do the same thing for copy number variants, but we don't have the same level of informatics and databasing in place as is being done for sequence variants. And I know that that's sort of a common thread across laboratories that have historically performed genomic microarray testing. But it's an area that we're actively working on. And as we do our variant investigations currently, we are querying our database to identify any potential variants that overlap live case CNVs that may also need to be updated.
Okay, and actually I forgot I did have one last slide before we go into the regular questions. So just in conclusion, the current ACMG ClinGen technical standards for constitutional CNVs represent an initial step toward a more structured, transparent method of CNV evaluation. We absolutely anticipate that updates and changes will be required over time as we gain more experience and knowledge. And you are really our partners in this process. So please continue to send in suggestions and feedback, etc. Always keep in mind, of course, that these changes may not happen instantaneously. And of course, any suggestions that we as ClinGen make, now or in the future outside of the published document are not reviewed or approved by ACMG until there is a formal update. So just to be very clear on that. Finally, please keep in touch with us because, like I said, we are working on a few things that I think you might be interested in the future, and we want to make sure that we can tell you about them. So please, follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube channel, indicate that you do want to be updated in our feedback survey, and then that way we can add you to our mailing list, and consider volunteering to curate for the dosage sensitivity group. And there is a button on the homepage of the ClinGen website if you're interested in that, and you can also go to that URL at the bottom of the screen. I will pause on it for a moment in case anybody wants to write that down, tinyurl.com/ClinGenVolunteer. And then with that, I'll leave it on the attendance code while we move on to the other questions. So before we do, I just want to confirm, Danny and Eric, are you guys both able to speak if you'd like to? Did I properly unmute you?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right, so I also wanted to mention there was a question that I typed an answer to. Someone was asking about the difference between Maine and LRG. And we actually had one of the curators from the Maine project give a really nice webinar to our ClinGen BioCurator group several months ago that kind of went through some of this. And I put a URL to the video in the answered question section. So if you are specifically interested in that, please go check that out. All right, so one question that we got for a CNV that is below a lab's reporting criteria, how do you suggest we report them, specifically for a VUS or an AR carrier status? And to that, I would say, and please other people correct me if you have a different opinion, but I feel like if you have specific reporting thresholds, and something does not meet your reporting thresholds, then you would not further evaluate it, you would not report it. Is that typically how that you operate, Erica or Eric or Danny?
Yeah, I agree. And I think, there's probably more consistency than variability across laboratories in terms of, reporting things like AR carrier status. We may have size criteria that say we'll report a deletion above 50 kb of size, but if you have a clear hit to a recessive disease gene, we will generally report that even if it's smaller than that.
Anyone else like to make any other comments?
I think that
and I see that
Okay.
the question was talking about intragenic CNV.
This is another question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I was actually going to do that question, so we'll just read it out to everyone. How would you recommend reporting an intragenic CNV in a gene associated with autosomal recessive disease, but the gain or loss would be classified as VUS?
So I can say that if it's been, so if the CNV has been established as resulting in a loss of function for a single copy of that gene, we will report it. We still, as you know, Erin mentioned, many of the aspects of this guidance can be utilized to evaluate autosomal recessive variants, including levels of evidence. So we kind of use the same process in terms of, has this variant been reported before in association with this phenotype? And if so, then we will likely report it as conferring autosomal recessive disease risk. But if there's, say, a partial gene duplication with a breakpoint in a recessive gene that has never been observed before, we may not report those because we're not certain that they confer a loss of function for even one allele.
Danny, what were you going to say?
I was going to say that it depends on the context of your test. So it could be a panel testing where you would be reporting carrier status as part of the panel as reproductive risk, and that may be combined, for instance, with a sequence variant in trans, and that would make the diagnosis. So it depends on what the scope of the test would be. So for chromosomal microarray, you may have the policy in the lab where you want to report pathogenic variants, in this instance, deletions or duplications that may be intragenic and cause it to be pathogenic as reproductive risk, or it may be associated with what the patient has. But if it's a panel, you're sort of obligated to report it anyways.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Danny. I was talking about in the context of genomic microarray testing for my answer.
All right, thank you. So the next question, how similar would a CNV in a previous case need to be to the current one to adopt its interpretation or classification, i.e. high Jacquard index, similar gene overlap / effect, if previous CNV was fully contained within the current one, etc. So, I mean, I think that's dependent, you know, that's not like the best answer, that's, you know, a black and white answer, but it's just really dependent on what was in that previous CNV and what you have in your current CNV. If, you know, your previous CNV was, you know, included one gene that we knew was haploinsufficient, and your next CNV includes the same gene, but maybe, you know, has other additional genes as well, you know, but it still includes that entire same haploinsufficient gene, then yes, I think you can use that same classification. You may still want to go on and make sure there's nothing else of relevance that you want to mention about the new CNV, but the fact that they both include that kind of rate limiting factor, that known haploinsufficient gene, would be enough to give it the same classification. Would anybody else like to elaborate on that or bring up other points?
I think that covers it.
Yeah, I agree. We're using greater than 99% overlap and 99% similarity to identify like exact matches in our like ClinVar submissions, for example, but we're still evaluating each CNV individually to determine if the probe, and again, this is from genomic microarray testing, if the probe performance shows that these are likely to be the exact same CNV.
All right, Danny, I will direct this next question to you. Using CMA, how do you score possibly disrupting duplications without knowledge of the duplicated sequence locus, possibly on another chromosome, tandem or inverted, or on the same chromosome?
It depends on the size, by and large. We had, I'm not doing chromosomal microarrays at this point, but before we had a policy where if a duplication was larger than 2 megabases, we would investigate whether it was inserted somewhere else. For duplications that occur within a gene or are small, there are papers out there that have actually characterized these duplications, and they are expected to be inserted direct and tandem in over 90% of them, or 90% of those occasions. So it is safe to assume that they are likely to be in tandem and direct. For ones that are larger, and larger could be, and that's more or less arbitrary, 1 to 2 megabases, then there's a higher risk that they can be recombined or inserted somewhere else.
Okay, thank you. We did get one comment in response to when I asked, what other, is anyone aware of any AI resources? And someone did mention that they used Franklin and gave a website for that. Just wanted to read it out so people watching the recording could also see that comment. So next question, using non-specific phenotype is the very opposite of using the most conservative approach, don't you think? This leads to more reporting of uncertain variants. And to that, I would counter, we recommend using the non-specific phenotype category because it is worth the smallest amount of points. And it is conservative in the sense that you are requiring more evidence in order to be able to make your case that, yes, I really do think this gene is causative of this disorder. The comment that it potentially leads to the reporting of more uncertain variants. I think, if you really are uncertain that a variant causes a disease, and we don't want to prematurely call it pathogenic when you're not sure, when the evidence isn't there. So that is why we are recommending using the lowest scoring category when you are not certain. I don't know if anybody else wants to make any comments to that effect. Okay, I guess not. The next question, one thing has been bothering me. If there is a CNV with no genes at all and no data in the literature or database is supportive that it's a population variant, it gets a score of 0, variant of uncertain significance. But normally we would not report those. Oh, there we go. What should we be doing? So in fact, I believe you were referring to section 1B, CNV with no genes at all, no functionally important elements, and the default score for that, I believe, is -0.6. And we did deliberate over this particular point, and the point being similar to the one that I just made, that if you're not sure, if you have no evidence one way or the other, it's really difficult to say for sure, yes, this is benign. So we wanted to set the point threshold such that, if you did indeed have additional evidence, like you were able to get parents and show that it was inherited in an apparently normal parent, or, that's not your question, but if there was population data to suggest that it was common, something else could bump it down into the benign region. But that by itself, just the state of having no information, shouldn't be automatically classified as benign. Would anybody else like to comment on that one?
I think you covered it.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to when I jumped into this section on the algorithm that we were.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, and then Erica, I think you did answer the question about discrepancies between RefSeq and Ensembl.
Yes.
Okay, and then yes, you did mention this, and I'll make this the last question in the last moment. So how did you decide how many points to add and subtract for each criterion, and which data were used to determine the specific points assigned for each criterion? So this is something that, remember that it took us several years to come up with this, and a lot of things have happened in the intervening years between when we first came up with this and now, and things will continue to happen in the future. But basically, we wanted to set the point threshold as something that was relatively easy for people to deal with in their heads. We didn't want to be, 0.1257 and making you add all of that together. but also relatively in sync stepwise with the sequence variance category of, supporting, moderate, etc. And so we had a lot of back and forth discussion and consensus amongst the group about which particular pieces of evidence we felt like were important to a CNV evaluation. A lot of just thought exercises going through, if this was the only thing that you knew about a CNV, what would you feel comfortable classifying it as? And kind of extrapolated our points down from there. I know there are people out there working on Bayesian analysis of how can we bring our variant classification procedures into this more mathematical framework, and we certainly keep our eye on this. And if the movement is toward that in the future, we will certainly be amenable to change as well. But that's something that we're always keeping an eye on. Would anybody else like to make any comments on that?
No, Erin, there was a question about where people could send questions after the series.
Yes, I saw that one and forgot it. But yes, always feel free to send your questions to ClinGen@clinicalgenome.org. And those will come to me, and we will do our best to get them answered for you. Also, just to remind you, there is an FAQ section on that CNV page where you go to find each of the recordings and the examples and things like that. We will be updating that periodically, with various questions that we receive. So always check that first, see if your question's there, and if not, just feel free to email ClinGen@clinicalgenome.org. But at this point, we are 1 minute over time. This was our last scheduled session. I want to thank everyone so much for participating in this with us. We've never done this before, but I hope that you found it useful. You will be getting that feedback survey later today, so please fill it out. Let us know what we can do to be better, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.